Good afternoon. The Minnesota Senate Jobs and Economic Growth, Finance and Policy Committee will come to order. Today is Monday, February 19, 2024. We welcome you to our first meeting of the year. Don't applaud. I understand that you all are looking like, oh, I really want to applaud so badly. Don't do it. A couple things that I'd like to tell you about overarching as our thoughts for this year's meetings. One is that we'll schedule hearings as needed. There will be some hearings that will be really about information, but information we can use. I will not just fill in hearings with information just for the sake of saying we're coming together. There will be some exciting things that we're going to talk about, like the 3 things today, but also like artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact or could impact workforce and innovation and all that other great stuff, and other topics of interest. But if you have any bills, we'll hear those expeditiously. You will see that we are changing one hearing. The one hearing that we have scheduled for Wednesday will include some bills instead, and that's just due to that committee that time needing to be rescheduled. So with that being said, we still have the same members as last year. Is there any member that want to say anything? But I do think it would be important for our lead, our minority lead, Senator Draheim, to just say welcome and say and make any comments that he has.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to hear that we are going to talk about some of those upcoming topics like AI and stuff that will affect, I think, every business in some manner, and I hope for the positive. And I know you have discussed with me in private some other things you're thinking of, and I'm excited for the year. I know it'll be a short one, and hopefully we can use our time wisely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Draheim. So without any other comments, or if anyone else has any other comments, or are we ready to go? And we do have a quorum, so a quorum is present. Now, today, we will be hearing a few different presentations. The first will be one from Susan Brower, our state demographer, which is always an incredibly informative session, and I thank her for being here. The second will be a presentation from MedTech 3.0, a collaboration seeking to help bring more federal funding to Minnesota. They are sending in their proposal at the end of February, and we're excited to hear how it's going. I know some individuals have said, what's MedTech 3.0? What's MedTech 3.0? You're going to hear about it today, and we're really excited that you all are here, and so thank you. Our final presentation today will be from the Women's Foundation, presenting their biennial status of Women and Girls report. I think it's important for us to know how our women and girls are doing, and if there's anything we can do to aid and abet their success, because women are the backbone of our wonderful society, and so I think we should do everything to elevate them and support them. So with that, we are ready to start with Ms. Brower. Please, she's here at the testifiers table, and anyone who's testifying, if you could be so kind as to make sure you're speaking into the mic, because we have some folks that are joining us by way of Zoom, but sometimes it's hard to hear in this room also if you're not incredibly close to that microphone. So with that being said, Ms. Brower, welcome, and you can go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Good morning, members. I will say that I'm not exactly sure how to flip. I'm seeing this in full presentation mode here on mine, and it's flipped here. So if there's anyone who knows how to flip that, have at it. Otherwise, I'm just going to move ahead with it as it is.
And just so you know, Ms. Brower, we also can see it here in front of us as well.
Wonderful.
They'll be able to move
It's fine
online.
as is. It's totally fine as is. I just wanted to let you know if it's bothering anyone, if someone wants to have at it.
We can't wait to hear all the great things that you're going to say.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So I work in the Department of Administration. I'm going to provide a brief overview of Minnesota's workforce, including the contribution of migration to growth and changes in the racial and ethnic composition of the state's workforce. You know what I'm about to say next. Minnesota's workforce growth has been slowing over time. We're looking at the long trajectory of growth since 1970, and we can see that Minnesota's workforce growth has slowed considerably beginning in about 2000. That very slow growth continues through today, and this is the result of both lower birth rates and, more recently, the retirements of the large baby boom generation. The youngest of the baby boomers still haven't retired, and so we will continue to see more retirements or increased number of retirements through 2029. In the next 15 years, we don't expect to see a sizable increase in the state's working age population. And so the number of people that we have working today, around 3.1 million, is about the same number we will have in 10 and 15 years, regardless of what happens with the number of jobs that we have. In Greater Minnesota regions of the state, in many regions within Greater Minnesota, we're actually projecting continued declines in workforce size, and that's happening as older workers continue to retire and there are fewer new workers to take their place. So we've looked at the number of Minnesotans in the labor force, the growth, and and what I expect it to be in the future. I want to put those numbers now in the context of the jobs that are available in the state. And what we're looking at here in the blue bars are the job openings in the state since January 2012. This graph goes through December of 23. And the kind of mountainous region, the peak that you see behind is the number of unemployed people. So you can compare at any given time over the last 10 or 12 years or so, the number of unemployed people versus the number of job openings that we have. We've just completed another full year where openings have exceeded the supply of workers. In 2023, Minnesota had about 200,000 job openings compared to about 93,000 unemployed people. And so if you put aside for a moment the unusual period of high unemployment during the COVID-19 pandemic, Minnesota has had more openings than unemployed individuals since about 2017. There was that period of disruption for a couple of years, but really if we look at the long run, those workforce shortages began to develop before the pandemic, and they have been sustained since unemployment has dropped and the magnitude has increased in terms of the shortages since the pandemic. Birth rates have been falling for at least the last 16 years, and so we know that there's not a surprise cohort of young people waiting to move into their working ages. So to the contrary, we know that the number of young workers will dwindle a bit in the coming years, and so it's important then to consider what role migration might play in future growth. And we're looking here at what our migration patterns have been for the state since 2010. Looking back, we have a fairly stable pattern of small domestic losses. Those are the blue bars. When they're negative, it means we lost more people to other states than we gained. There are a few years in there where we gained more than we lost. But for the last 20 years in general, what we see are regular net domestic losses. And this is true of the Midwest as well. It's not unique to Minnesota. What Minnesota also has is some fairly stable, regular net gains due to international migration. Those are the gray bars. And when you put together international immigration and domestic migration, you get that line across. That's total migration and tells you kind of the contribution of all movement, whether it's positive or negative. During the pandemic, we had some big disruptions due to college migration mostly. And so you can see in 2022 that there were sizable losses for that year. But in 2023, it looks to be back to kind of business as usual for Minnesota with modest losses that are fully countered by international immigration. And so in total, we're receiving more people than we're losing due to migration. So what do these migration numbers mean? Is that a lot of people? Is that not a lot of people? Well, one way that we can scale migration to workforce is to look at some of the change numbers that we see. And so we're looking here, the first kind of 3 bars on the left that you see are the migration of workers now. We were just looking at the migration of all people. Now we're looking just at people who are in the workforce. We gain about 67,000 workers on average each year from other states, but we lose slightly more than that at about 70,000. So the net loss of workers, it's small, but it's fairly steady at just under 3,000 in recent years. Then in contrast, I don't have an in and out flow for international migrants, but I have an estimate of the net that's just under about 6,000. And then if you put together the domestic workers and the international workers, you get to about 3,000 people added because of all migration in the state. Again, is that a big number? Is that a small number? Well, in recent years, the labor force has grown by about 7,600 people each year, which is a small number by historical standards. But that 3,000 additional folks is a sizable contribution to the growth that we do have. It could be more. It would be nice if it were more, if we saw more growth due to migration, but that's kind of where we're at right now. That much of the growth that we do have is due to the influx of international workers.
Ms. Bauer, we do have a question from Senator Drahan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I had a question on the international workers, that net gain. Is that mainly K2 visas, or what, or is that people actually moving here, or is that just workers coming on a 6-month visa? Can you elaborate a little bit more into that, please?
Ms. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Senator Drahan, the estimate comes from a net number that the Census Bureau gives us of people in their working age, and to it I applied the proportion that are in the workforce. So it's really a derived estimate. It's not something where we're counting up the number of workers from the data source. We unfortunately don't have that level of detail to say what type of visa or what type of work they're doing. It's really just a big, broad number of how many are gained.
Senator Drahan, any follow-up?
Yeah, so we don't know if they're permanent residents of Minnesota, or are they temporary workers that maybe some the meat packing plants have brought in. I know a large number of workers every year that they cycle through. So we don't have data on that would work with that 5,800 number.
Ms. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Senator, we don't from this particular data source. I would expect it would be a mix of both. It is the net in any year, so if there are people leaving, it's accounting for that. It's the net gain, so the net of all the movement.
Senator Drahan.
I'm good, thank you.
Senator Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Brown, I have a question about slide number 5. On the chart where it says 70,000 domestic workers out, is that disarticulated by age to any extent? Do we know if these are people who are leaving the state to go take jobs in other states, or are they people who are retiring and moving out of the state? Do we have a way of understanding that?
Ms. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Senator, these are people who moved in the last year and are currently working wherever they're living in the new place. It may include people who moved for college and also have a job in their new place. It may be people that moved fully for a job. It may be people that are partially retired. They moved recently and now are working elsewhere.
Senator Putnam, any follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Putnam kind of raised a question that I hadn't realized. How do we count retirements in this? Are they domestic workers out included in that number?
Ms. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Senator, they're not included in these numbers if they are retired. These are only people who are working when I'm looking at domestic workers in and out. If we look at the numbers that we were looking at previously, these are all people of all ages in and out of the workforce. And so the total number of migrants is a little bit bigger than that worker. Those numbers would include retirees.
Senator Pratt, any follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, so when I look at domestic workers in, if somebody retired during that period of time, they would be out of both the numerator and the denominator.
Ms. Brower, did you hear the question?
Mr. Chair, I did.
Okay.
They would not be included in this number if they're either, if there was a numerator or a denominator, they would not be included in it because they're out of the equation altogether. Yes.
And members, if I can remind you, you can ask questions at any time, but when you ask your question, can you make sure your voice stays up? Because sometimes by natural habit, we start louder and then we get soft, and then you end up making me strain my ears, and I don't like to strain my ears, okay? So help me out. Ms. Brower, you'd like to continue?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So while losses due to domestic migration are not slowing the labor force a great deal, it's a small number each year, it hasn't been helping much either. And international migration has been helping labor force growth, but it could do so more. The need for workers exists as evidenced by the number of job openings. So if we look at that 163,000, that's the average for the last 5 years of job openings, compare it to the number that we've gained due to migration, there's a large gulf. We would have to see significant changes in migration patterns, and they would need to be sustained year over year to actually close that gap. So migration can help, but it's a long way off in terms of the current levels that we're seeing in order to fill the gaps that we're currently seeing.
And Ms. Bauer, just so that I'm clear, when you look at that domestic workers out, that 70,000 plus, I think you said that number also includes college students who are leaving and going to work someplace, because it's my understanding that age group, 18 to 34, is the biggest number or demographic that leaves the state. Am I right or wrong about that, or can you shed some light on that?
Mr. Chair, that's correct. When we look at young people, those most likely to move are those 15 to 19 years old. Most are going to college. They may also have a part-time job and would be included in these numbers. As I said, these numbers include anyone who has a job after they've moved, anyone who's considered a worker in the new state where they are. If we look at those who are a little bit older, there's less migration, and the net in and out comes to about zero.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So now I'm going to turn to some numbers about Minnesota's workforce and how that's been changing with respect to race and ethnicity. You can see here that the state's workforce has become more diverse over time. Right now, about 23% of the workforce, or 3.1 million workers, are workers of color. That's about 704,000 workers in the state. The percentage has been growing by about 1% per year, and that's both because there are more BIPOC workers and also because there are fewer white workers in the state as the baby boomers retire. I should note that the data that I'm sharing with you come from the American Community Survey for 2022. Yes, you do have more recent numbers elsewhere, but this particular survey gives you the most clear detail on differences for different groups of people, including by gender, by race, by different occupations. So that's why I'm sharing with you the latest, greatest 2022 numbers. Unemployment rates for all race groups have steadily declined between 2010 and 2019. The 2010 unemployment was still elevated after the Great Recession, and that next period saw year-over-year declines for nearly every racial ethnic group of labor force participants. The COVID-19 pandemic temporarily reversed some of those gains, but we can see in 2022 that unemployment continued to fall after those disruptions were resolved. For American Indian and Black or African American labor force participants, the decline in unemployment has perhaps been the most dramatic, as both groups had unemployment near 20% in 2010. In 2022, 8.4% of American Indians in the labor force were unemployed, and about 8% of Black or African Americans in Minnesota. 4.2% was the unemployment rate for Latinos, 2.8% for Asians, and 2.7% for whites. So disparities in unemployment clearly remain in 2022, but the gaps that we saw, particularly coming off of the Great Recession, have closed somewhat, as those historical rates have fallen faster for some groups than for others.
Ms. Bauer, can I ask a question related to that? When you look at the Black unemployment number, 8.0%, and you talked about how it was as high as 20% in 2010, are you including Africans and African Americans under that Black number?
Mr. Chair, yes. This is the Census Bureau's major race group that we're looking at here. We do have some additional data that's not as timely that separates some of our larger immigrant Black groups from US-born African Americans, but as we're looking at it here, it's combined.
So that would be important in my mind to sort of get that information, if you're able to share that disaggregated data, just because if we're looking at tailoring strategies, it would be important to know what we need to do in order to help any group. And I guess that would be the same question under the Asian category as well, because you have, Hmong and others. And so it's really important, to me at least, to kind of understand that picture, because if we want to be, again, strategic and surgical in our approach, it's important to have that information. All right. Senator Hurt?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to mention the same thing that you just said at the tail end part, but thank you.
They say that great minds think alike, so I'm happy to know that you and I both were thinking the same thing. Anyone else on that question? If not, Ms. Bauer, you can go forward. Thank you for that information.
Mr. Chair, thank you. And I will say we have a report called The Economic Status of Minnesotans that I will share with you that breaks down the employment situations of Minnesota's largest cultural groups, including Black immigrant groups and Asian immigrants. Immigrants. They've been in Minnesota for generations, many of them. But it gives that detail, I think, that you're seeking. It's just not as recent, and we don't have the kind of full time trajectory for that group. So, yes, I will share that. There are other indicators that the employment picture has improved for some workers of color over the same time period. Some labor force numbers, some employment numbers. But I won't go into the detail, but I just wanted to note that has been the case for some indicators that we look at over time, some of these large trends. And so while our state has become more diverse over the past 10 years, there are some signs of improvement in some of the labor force indicators. However, the disparities do still remain till today. And one example of that are the significant disparities in earnings across groups of Minnesota workers. So we're looking at the median earnings of Minnesota's full-time year-round workers in 2022. On average, women earn less than men within every racial group, and workers of color continue to earn less than white workers. This is true for both male and female workers. And these are the most recent numbers from the 2022 survey data. The median marks the point at which half of the workers earn more and half earn less. For Black, Latino, and American Indian men, all earn around $50,000 per year at the median. And the median is about $71,000 for white men in Minnesota. Asian men earned somewhere in the middle with about $62,000 per year. Again, full-time year-round workers. The disparities are similar for women, with Black, Latino, and American Indian women earning around $41,000 per year, and Asian women earning about $52,000, compared to white women who earn on average about $59,000. Across all of these groups, there are differences in the age composition. Workers of color tend to be younger and may have lower wages because of that. But also, we know that there are differences in educational attainment and the related occupational structure by race as well. And the final table in your packets, and that I'll share here, is just an example of the largest share of workers within each occupation group, just to give an example of how different the occupational structure is across race and genders. I do have full occupational breakdown if you have the interest and the time at some point, but I just wanted to give you this example to show that underlying those disparities in income really are related to the jobs that people hold as well. So for the group of male workers, for example, about 15% of male workers are in management occupations, and the median for management occupations is about $94,000 a year for median earnings. For Black women, the most common occupation group as of 2022 are in healthcare support. 17% of all Black women are working in healthcare support. The median there is $27,000 a year, half of which earn below that $27,000, half above. For American Indian men, 18% are in food prep and serving. That's the most common group there. Median earnings for men in this group is $17,000. So in closing, as I said last year when I was before this committee, I do not expect to see much growth in Minnesota's workforce without major sustained changes to either domestic migration or international migration or both. The workforce will continue to become more racially and ethnically, culturally, linguistically, religiously diverse into the future. And while there have been some improvements in the employment picture for workers of color in the state over the last 10 years, disparities remain, particularly when we're looking at earnings. The disparities in earnings and occupational structure remain significant today. This concludes my prepared remarks, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Any questions? Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Brower. A very interesting report. I have one thing that I did not notice in here. Maybe you've addressed it already. You know, one of the things that underpins our population in general, of course, is the birth rate. And we know that at least, I believe, for many years, maybe a couple decades, we've seen a declining birth rate. Do you happen to have a slide that shows Minnesota's birth rate for the last few decades?
Ms. Bauer.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I wish I did. It's in my head.
It's in my head too, but I'd like to see a slide.
I can absolutely share that with you. We've seen a difference of about 10,000 births over the last decade. The largest cohort in the recent period is of those born in 2007, and since that time it's been declining, and it's down by about 10,000 young people, babies per year. And so if we think about that 16-year-old span, that's just the number that are now moving into the workforce. We expect those numbers to continue to decline into the future because that's generally what's happening with birth rates.
Any follow-up, Senator Nelson? Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's just such an important statistic, certainly for the Jobs Committee, as we see those babies from 2007 entering the workforce, but also when we think about education and declining enrollment. So if you'll send me that, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. One of the things that I want you all to really think about and why this discussion is important, and and we will build on this discussion going forward, is because when you get to artificial intelligence, there is also an occupational shift in some of the areas that are highly populated by certain groups as well. And so to think about how we're going to deal with that in real time will make a difference. Senator Drahan, did I see your hand up? Senator Drahan.
Sorry, thank you. Important discussion going on.
No, you see, now, Senator Putnam, as you know, is a professor. Now, if someone was talking during his lecture, I'm sure he would have something to say to him.
Well, it's,
Senator Drahan.
Chair, it's funny, we were talking about the slide on college education, so it was related to his expertise. My question is, can we get the data emailed to us on slide 8? Do you have that in the averages instead of median? It'd be interesting to kind of compare the two. And then on slide 9, just curiosity, extraction, is that mining? Or what is that classified as?
Ms. Bauer, to those two questions.
Mr. Chair, Senator Drahan, I'm not sure if the Census Bureau publishes the average. I'll look, and if they do, I'll certainly send it on. They may publish a distribution, which I could also send. To the second point, yes, extraction includes mining.
Any other questions to Ms. Brower? Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for going through this. This is very interesting information. Something Senator Nelson brought up, and you'll recall when you and I first started working on this committee together back in 2019, we talked about the demographic problem. This was a kind of a slow problem that we saw exacerbated in 2020 and 2021. But I'm still looking at slide 4 and the migration, and I'm wondering if we have any demographic information on both the in-migration and the out-migration. One of the reasons I was interested in retirement is that, anecdotally, what I'm finding is that when people are reaching the end of their career or retiring is when they're moving out of state and taking their taxable wealth with them. And wondering if that's having an impact on the out-migration as well. And then, Mr. Chair, let's do that, and then I think I have one more comment after that.
Ms. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I've pulled up a set of slides that I kind of keep hidden just in case I get these questions. And here is one demographic dimension of migration. So we're looking here at in and out migrants recently from the state of Minnesota by age. And so if you can see the difference between those bars, the green bars are out and the blue bars are in. That's the net loss or net gain in any age group. Overwhelmingly, the number of people who move in any given year are young. The losses of those that, in the workforce are young, but we do lose also people who are of retirement age to usually warmer climates. We've got data on that as well that I'm happy to share.
Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It just proves that I hang out with an elderly group. What I hear anecdotally. My other concern is when we talk about jobs, we talk about it in the aggregate, and we're not looking at, let's say, the quality of job and the livable wage of a job. For instance, in 2023, I went back and looked, we had over 5,600 layoffs in the state of Minnesota, up from 1,500 in 2022. So we may have a lot of open jobs, but what we're not looking at is what are the comparable jobs of those that are being lost versus those that are being opened. And I'd like to see us maybe spend a little more time around that issue as well to make sure that Minnesotans are getting not just entry-level jobs, but permanent careers.
Ms. Brower, you have any information around that or any comments or?
Mr. Chair, I would just agree with that comment wholeheartedly. I mean, I think we're at a point now where jobs are abundant, but not necessarily good jobs. And so I think it is incumbent on us now to look to the opportunities of the jobs that may help people cover basic living expenses, in addition to the jobs that are needed to care for and educate our residents as well. That's kind of another subset that I would add there that I think needs attention under these conditions of scarcity.
Ms. Brown, do you see any nexus between, let's say for an example, individuals who are in that young category, maybe not in college, but maybe a little older, who are now able to work from home, and then therefore they could move to a warmer climate, place or space that affects the number of jobs, number of individuals that we have available to us here in Minnesota?
Mr. Chair, it's possible that may be happening, but we don't have enough data yet to be able to uncover that specific trend.
Thank you so much. Senator Nelson, I think you had a question?
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to kind of build upon Senator Pratt's question and the chart that you have up. So while we can see the numbers of the exodus being larger in our younger populations, but we can continue to see that out-migrants exceeding in-migrants as our population gets older. And my question is, this might not be something for your department, but maybe a joint graph with the Department of Revenue's graph. It'd be quite interesting to see the tax revenues that leave our state. So even though we see that there's a smaller, perhaps, out-migration in these upper 70, 74, 60, 50, starting probably at age 60 on up. The question really should become, I think, important for us as state legislators, the tax revenue that goes with that wealth. And I think that would be an important statistic for us going forward. While we can't do much about our climate, we can do things about our tax climate. And those are things I'd like to look at. Thank you.
Ms. Brower, any comments, or are you okay?
Mr. Chair, there is a data set that the IRS puts together of migration that might be of interest to you, and so I can point you toward that as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Members, thank you so much for that robust conversation. We know that Ms. Brower is going to send us some additional information, and we thank you, Ms. Brower, for always giving us incredibly detailed and substantive information, and we look forward to getting that information from you in the future. And if there's anything else you would like for us to know, feel free to send that information, and we will distribute it widely. Thank you. All right. Thank you, members, for that rich discussion that we just had. Now, next up, we will call Peter Frosch from Greater MSP to present about MedTech 3.0. Do you have a computer? Do you need a computer or anything?
I do not. I'm
Okay.
going to do it the old-fashioned way.
He is ready to give it to us. So thank you so very much. So to the testifier, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony, and welcome.
Thank you, Chair, Ranking Member, members of the committee. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Frosch. I am the CEO of the Greater MSP Partnership. For context, Greater MSP is a public-private partnership. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that works like a co-op. Instead of having members we represent or serve, Greater MSP is made up of investors and partners who come together to do things they can't do alone. Over 300 leading companies, universities, cities, counties, foundations, all working together as one team with one mission to grow the economy of the Minneapolis-St. Paul region so we have more great jobs, great careers, and wealth-building opportunities for residents of this region and state. So thank you for the invitation to share Minnesota MedTech 3.0 with the committee. It's an exciting effort Greater MSP is leading to fulfill on that mission. And we have a leave behind with a lot of data and background on MedTech 3.0 that we can provide to each of the committee members following the presentation. Well, I'll start with why MedTech 3.0 matters. MedTech 3.0 is one of the big things that we need to do in this state to create a vibrant, competitive, inclusive economy for Minnesotans. And it matters to the world because it's how some of today's most serious challenges in health and medicine will be solved. MedTech 3.0 will create thousands of new good-paying jobs in Minnesota that won't be automated. It will accelerate economic growth, generate tax revenues needed to support state programs, and renew our reputation as a place and people with the courage to tackle hard problems and the know-how to solve them. So, what is this MedTech 3.0? Minnesota MedTech 3.0 is a new strategy created and owned by a new coalition. It isn't a new program or organization. It's something different, much larger in scale and scope and potential. We're describing MedTech 3.0 as a new hub that Greater MSP is building and leading, a hub where more than 30 organizations are already working together in coalition. And that coalition includes, it's a warning, this is a bit of a list, Medtronic and Boston Scientific, the Mayo Clinic, Health Partners and Allina, United Health Group, Medica, the University of Minnesota, Minnesota State, Medical Alley, MEDA, the Center for Economic Inclusion, the Destination Medical Center, venture capital firms and startup accelerators, and public partners, including the state of Minnesota, with leadership from Governor Walz and Minnesota DEED. This is a healthcare dream team, and I'm glad to say that several leaders from the team are in the audience today. I want to thank them for everything they are doing. The team includes global leaders, along with groups historically excluded from the medtech industry and its benefits, and the team will keep on growing. Dozens of leaders and experts from these organizations are now collaborating to implement the shared strategy they created last summer. That strategy is focused on building a healthcare system in this country that is more innovative, more equitable, and more affordable. A healthcare system that improves outcomes for patients and ensures the best medical technology is accessible to more people, especially lower-income patients. MedTech 3.0 aims to do this with two main approaches. First is using technology to accelerate the pace of innovation. Even in 2024, with all the incredible medical advancements we've seen, there will still be too many moments in Minnesota's hospitals today when a doctor turns to their patient and family and says, "I'm sorry, there's nothing else we can do." We need new cures and treatments, and to find them, we are going to make MedTech smarter. MedTech 3.0 combines traditional medical technology with new digital tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence. Putting these cutting-edge tools to work in healthcare will enable us to deliver new solutions faster. The second pillar is about rethinking how the pieces of the healthcare puzzle fit together. Now, one of the reasons MedTech 3.0 is being created here and not somewhere else in the country is because we have so many big pieces of that puzzle. Today, Minnesota is home to the world's largest medical device companies, the nation's largest private insurer and other nation-leading insurers, the world's top-ranked hospital and other nation-leading hospital systems, the nationally recognized industry organization Medical Alley, and one of the country's best public universities with a medical school and leading researchers in medtech, health, and bioscience. Now, all these assets and more exist in our state today, but they are more disconnected than you'd expect, and collaboration is more ad hoc than we want. We are missing opportunities every month to find the solutions patients urgently need. That's why the second pillar of MedTech 3.0 is a super-connected healthcare innovation ecosystem that works together more often and more strategically. And this is already in motion. As of this week, 170 leaders from 30 organizations in the MedTech 3.0 coalition are designing projects that they would do together for mutual benefit. These include a new data sharing alliance among some of Minnesota's largest healthcare institutions, joint investments to grow our ecosystem of healthcare startups, and a new shared workforce plan focused on recruiting, developing, retaining, and attracting the thousands of people we need from entry level to expert level, all good jobs with livable wages and career pathways. These are the first of what will be many projects jointly created and jointly implemented as part of MedTech 3.0. 1 year ago, in February of 2023, none of this existed. It all began when Medtronic CEO Jeff Martha approached Greater MSP with an idea. And he said something like, there's a new generation of MedTech ready to be created. And we're best positioned to do that in Minnesota. But if we don't, some other region in the US or world is going to do it. And he said he knew this to be true because Medtronic was getting pitched by places around the country and world to help them build new health hubs. Well, Jeff's concept was consistent with the region's economic strategy, so we engaged CEOs from other healthcare companies who agreed to explore it together. In April of last year, we stood up a task force through the Itasca project to turn this idea into a project. And just as we were getting started, the federal government released the Tech Hubs competition. Tech Hubs is a first-of-its-kind national effort to build up centers of excellence in industries that are priorities for U.S. national and economic security. The Tech Hubs competition had a very aggressive deadline and set of requirements, but we were ready with a big idea and a winning team, and MedTech was one of the national priority industries identified. So, win or lose, we reasoned, applying for Tech Hubs would accelerate and focus our effort. So in the summer of 23, Greater MSP led the effort to expand the coalition, conduct an analysis, develop a strategy, and submit an application by the August 15th deadline. We accomplished in 3 months what we hoped might be possible in 6 months or more. And in October, over MEA weekend, I remember because I was in Grand Marais with my family, the White House called Senator Klobuchar and Governor Walz, and they called me and told me I couldn't call anybody because the news that we had won the Tech Hubs competition was going to be announced by the president on Monday. So the president announced from the White House that Minnesota MedTech 3.0 was designated as a U.S. Tech Hub. That means that MedTech 3.0 is now recognized by the federal government as one of the country's leading strategies for growing America's technology leadership. The win comes with access to specific trade and investment programs and a brand we can use to market ourselves in the global economy as America's MedTech leader. Winning also qualified us for phase 2 of Tech Hubs, which began immediately, somewhat unfortunately. In phase 2, we are competing for federal funding against the other U.S. regions designated as Tech Hubs. So 31 hubs across the country are now competing for 5 to 10 awards of around $50 million each. That federal funding would jumpstart specific elements of MedTech 3.0, the strategy, especially those actions that companies are challenged to pay for without some sort of public partnership. We are racing towards a February 29th submission deadline. We're told that winners will be announced this summer, and I'm glad to discuss this phase 2 competition in more detail if there's interest. But it's important to know that win or lose phase 2, MedTech 3.0 is moving ahead. We have a nation-leading strategy, a world-leading coalition, and a federal Tech Hubs designation. $50 million in federal funding would be very advantageous, but MedTech 3.0 is a multi-billion-dollar effort. And as I mentioned at the start, we feel this strategy is something we must advance because it's critical to the future of Minnesota's economy and quality of life. Today, Minnesota's economy includes 15,000 healthcare organizations, including the top 15 medical device companies in the world. 470,000 Minnesotans are employed in this industry. To put that into context, that is the number of residents combined of Rochester, St. Cloud, Duluth, Mankato, Bloomington, Fridley, and my hometown of Winona. Minnesota's economy is a healthcare economy. We have a lot to lose, so we have to have a plan to win. Technology is going to disrupt healthcare and MedTech this decade, and MedTech 3.0 is our plan to do the disrupting. It's our plan for protecting the great jobs we have and adding thousands more, and for winning more than our fair share of the $768 billion of global MedTech growth projected over the next 5 years. MedTech 3.0 is part of a portfolio of bold action that Greater MSP is leading to make Minnesota a global destination for innovation and inclusive growth. Efforts that all require creative collaboration between the private sector and the state, including the Minnesota Sustainable Aviation Fuel Hub, a regenerative agriculture strategy, a global protein strategy, green steel and green ammonia, biomanufacturing, and many more. Turning these opportunities into wins will make Minnesota the problem-solving capital of the new economy, a place that puts prosperity within reach for everyone. We can do these things, and we can become that place if the business community and state government come together, get creative, and produce solutions that the moment demands. Thank you for your interest and your partnership.
Thank you so much. And just for clarity, I'm excited about the fact that you all have been selected as a hub and able to compete for those federal funds. I, along with Senator Nelson, got a chance to hear the presentation when you all were here not long ago, and we felt it was a very informative and very worthwhile initiative. And so we wanted you to come and be able to present and tell this wonderful committee about it. Just for clarity, you all are going to have to submit the application, is it by February 2024?
February 29th, just a couple weeks from now.
All right, good. And then you expect to hear back by when? Sometime this summer? You don't have any other
The EDA
guidance about that?
indicated that this summer.
Okay. And we know, just so that everyone knows, that they're competing for, as you heard him testify to, $500 million that the federal government has put forth. So it's either going to be, 5, 10, or 15, applicants that would be selected. So we are hoping for Minnesota to be provided some revenue. Can you share, and I know that it's on the mind of the individuals around the table, if there's anything we need to do as a committee in order to, or as a state, in order to increase our chances? It's my understanding there's nothing we need to do but look really good and hope that your committee does a great job writing that application. Can you correct me if I'm wrong?
Mr. Chair, today that's correct. We're not here with any ask. We want to thank DEED and others at the state who have been very active in support of this effort. There's an active dialogue and problem-solving effort how the state of Minnesota will play a role in ensuring that we are competitive to win.
Any questions from the committee? Senator Nelson?
Well, you read my mind, Mr. Chair. Didn't even have that
It's a
hand up.
talent I have. It's just a talent I have. Senator Nelson.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, Peter, for the good work. Look forward to strong application. And I think it might be important for this committee to also note the regional aspect of the MedTech 3.0. If you want to just address a little bit about that, I think that's important too. It's important to all of us, but we want to make sure that we have that front and center as well.
Mr. Ross.
Mr. Chair, Senator, that's absolutely correct. So today, this coalition is a very robust kind of cross-regional partnership between the Metro and Rochester. Greater MSP and the Destination Medical Center are working in tandem, in lockstep, as is the Mayo Clinic and Medtronic and all these other institutions. There are also opportunities to be working with other regions around the state. And this month we have conversations upcoming with the economic development groups in Duluth and St. Cloud and Mankato and Ready and Rochester. We have an ongoing constant dialogue about various things that we could be working together on. And so to ensure that all regions of the state can participate actively in this opportunity. But the relationship with Rochester in particular is deep, and the Destination Medical Center recently made a kind of formal commitment to be part of this effort.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Nelson. Any other questions? Senator Hurd.
Chair Champion, thank you. I just want to make a comment and maybe just dab into one simple question, but this is a very exciting project, you know, and so good luck to you, and it be for all of us. And so I just want to put a thought, and I'm sure Senator Champion have mentioned a number of times that make sure that, you know, equity of people of color are, you know, in your thought as well as we progress. And when you do get the funding, it's $500 or $700 billion. That's a lot of great money. So let's put it into good use in terms of diversity. And I thought back, you know, not so much about my own culture, but when I look at the migration from the South, and, you know, on our Black American or African community, engineers and scientists are moving from the South up here during certain time, the development of 3M and all that, you know, but you know, the numbers seem to dwindle, you know, because I see folks that are scientists in big technology company and healthcare, but the population now changed because we didn't care much about diversity over time. So, you know, again, just a shout out for you to give some thoughts on that. My simple question to you is, I know I can look at YouTube and just find the number, but you said how many jobs is this in association of?
Mr. Frost.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I could follow up with a specific number. I mean, it would be in the thousands of new jobs, and kind of this is part of the analysis that we're doing right now. And so we can follow up with a kind of an estimate on our target for job creation and retention, which to your point is part of that. And if I could also address your earlier comment, which is very helpful and spot on. To win this competition, we have to put forward an inclusive proposal. Helpfully, the rules of the Tech Up's proposal from this administration put a priority on economic inclusion. And so the strategies that we're putting forward in terms of entrepreneurship and in workforce development have integrated in them, you know, very focused in inclusionary strategies. And to your point about migration, I think there is a link to the previous presentation from Ms. Brower. And what we are aiming to do here with MedTech 3.0 is to turn the magnet on very high and keep, you know, the best talent we have and draw more great talent from across the country and the world to this place. Thank you.
Any follow-up, Senator Hurd?
Yeah, and again, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. I also want to pin down some specific points. Senator Champion already mentioned about, you know, even in the Asian silo, there's, you know, very diverse and Hmong and Lao, Cambodian, and pretty much under the category of South Asian, are, you know, in disparity, and the number of the percentage that we put here are not quite accurate to represent that population. So do keep that in mind as well. Thank you.
Senator Mohammed.
I'm just wondering if this is just for Minneapolis and St. Paul, or does it include surrounding areas?
Good question, Mr. Chair, Senator. It includes the metro, other regions in Minnesota, and, you know, effectively the whole state as we roll this out. Greater MSP is a metro-focused economic development partnership. It is the partnership for the metro region. And the rules of the Tech Hub's competition required a region to apply. So that is why Greater MSP applied. But now, as we build this strategy out, we are truly thinking about this as a statewide strategy.
Follow-up, Senator Mohammed? Any other questions? Well, the one thing that I'll say is thank you so very much for your work, and thank you for, you know, the application work, but also just working with the coalition. One of the things that I would always encourage us to do is to think about what our wonderful demographer has been talking about, which was today, just when you think in terms of growth and where people of color and others are starting to, you know, come more to the forefront when you think in terms of birth rates and all the other information, as well as international migration. that becomes really important to think about developing a pool of potential young people who will be able to grow into these important marketplaces. I know just recently, as a part of a Black History series that I helped with on February 10th, we had a STEM Saturday where we encourage young people to come from all over to get more involved in STEM and those who are interested in STEM. And in fact, at that event, where it was a collaboration between Harvard's Best Academy, the University of Minnesota, OIC, which is Occupational Industrial, centers, industrial centers, OIC, but also our office was also a part of it. We, on that particular Saturday, with Dr. Childs coming as well, we had over 200 young people who came to that science event. And we connected Black inventors because, of course, it's Black History Month, so I wanted them to see. And Senator Gustafson had a chance to join us, and Senator Muhammad as well. So I would encourage you all to think about creative ways to make sure that young people are engaged, because we're going to need them not just for the present, but also for the future. So thank you again for all of your great work.
Thank
Any
you, Mr.
closing
Chair.
comments?
Well, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share this information. We hope we will be willing to come back. This work is going to continue no matter what going forward. But to your closing comment, this is absolutely about recruitment. And I think a focus and a sense of purpose is really at the center of what we're doing. The future economy of Minnesota is not going to just happen. We have to build it, we have to engineer it, we have to create it. And if the workforce of the future has to be recruited and built and engineered. And so that's the spirit with which we're approaching this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And whenever you all hear me, you can go ahead. Whenever you all hear me talk about inclusion, it is not to the exclusion of anyone, but for us to be very intentional about how we reach out to a cross-section of people in Minnesota, because we are one Minnesota, and we need to continue to be globally competitive, not just competitive with Iowa. All right? So with that being said, I am now going to go to our last, but certainly not least. We'll welcome Cynthia Barley, the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the Women's Foundation, up to present. And I think, are we also still having Gloria Perez? And Dr. Christina Ewig. There we go. See, I knew that you were going to correct me, and I'm always so up to that. So thank you so much. Who's going to start off?
Thank you, Senator Champion. My name is Gloria Perez. For the record, I'm going to start. I am the President and CEO of the Women's Foundation. And thank you for this opportunity to present the Status of Women and Girls report about how women and girls are faring in Minnesota. We're going to move to slide 2 here. So for 40 years, the Women's Foundation has invested more than $49 million in organizations across the state, seeing and hearing from our communities about the realities that women and girls face and advancing policies that advocate for them. I'm here today with Dr. Christina Ewig, who leads the research, which is most comprehensive report of its kind in the state. Since 2009, we have partnered with the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy at the Humphrey School to produce this report, which looks at how women and girls are faring in the areas of economics, safety, health, and leadership. We share this data with you as you consider important policy and funding choices. We can go to the next slide. We know the data and from listening to women and girls across Minnesota, that if we improve economic security and safety for women, we can fulfill our state's promise and ensure that our renowned quality of life is experienced by all families. Women in our state are critical to economic growth and competitiveness and are essential contributors to families, communities, and the workforce. Yet while some women and girls are thriving, too many are not safe and do not have access to economic opportunities because of barriers they face, often because of their gender, race, ethnicity, geography, ability, or sexuality. This research is unique in that it looks at traditional race and ethnic categories, but other kinds of backgrounds like the experience of women in greater and rural Minnesota, and how these attributes affect their experience with access and opportunities. Whenever possible, the research also looks at major immigrant groups in our state. On our next slide, we know that this research is not an end in and of itself. It helps inform the investments we make, from grant making to policy, and it's a jumping off point to listen to and invest in communities directly impacted by the disparities we see in the data, which is why we come before you today. We know that this committee knows the power you have to make a difference in the lives of women and families, as we'll see with the paid family and medical leave law taking effect. As we'll highlight at the end of the presentation, this report is really meant to be a tool for action, so elected officials and decision makers across sectors can use their influence to address inequities in the fields, instead of placing the burden on the women and communities most impacted. This is why at the Women's Foundation, we fund solutions that target the root causes of the disparities we see in the report. And today, we're going to focus on the research in economics and leadership that informs the work of this committee. Because Minnesota women are second in the nation in women's workforce participation, and in many cases are the heads of their households, we know that their economic success is directly tied to the well-being of children and families. We know that economic security intersects with every other issue in a woman's life, including her health, safety, and access to leadership opportunities. And so it's crucial that we invest in creating opportunities that sustain women's lives as caregivers for families and communities. So to talk more about the economic building blocks that matter to women and families, I will hand it over to Dr. Ewig. Thank you.
For the record, my name is Christina Ewig. I'm Professor of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where I'm also Director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. Thank you, Chair Champion, for this opportunity to share our latest research with you and the committee today. As Gloria mentioned, Minnesota women do lead the nation, or are second in the nation in terms of workforce participation. They also compose a majority of those that have secondary, post-secondary degrees in the state, but that has not necessarily added up to economic security for women. I'm going to focus my presentation today on the gender wage gap because wages are a key to economic security. So with the graph that you see here, we have the average wages of men compared to women and disaggregated by race and ethnic groups. Overall, women of all races and ethnicities make 81 cents for every dollar that a white male makes. Now, if we break that up into different groups, we can see that white women make just a little bit over that average at 82 cents for every dollar earned by a white male. For Asian American women, that's 72 cents, Black 62, Native American 64, and Latinas 57. And I know a couple of the senators have had questions about disaggregation further, especially into the categories of Asian and Black. If we look, for example, at the largest Asian subcategory, or Hmong, within this data, we see that Hmong women earn closer to what Latinas do at 55 cents on a dollar earned by white men. Somali women earn even less at 41 cents.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
And then I go to Senator Nelson. Is it possible for you all to consider this? I think sometimes what's misleading or not as helpful as I'm sure that you'd like for it to be, because when I see this bold language, which I usually see whenever we are comparing the wages of women to men, is usually a white woman's wage compared to a man, and it leaves a lot to be understood, because if it's clear that Black women make 62 cents on the dollar, Somali women make 41 cents on the dollar, and others, sometimes we are quoting something to others to say women make 81 cents to every male, and that doesn't really capture this story. And I don't know how best to wrestle with that, but I think it leads one to believe that if I say a Black woman, without getting into this data, that she makes 81 cents on the dollar. So can you help me understand why we do that, and is there any way to do it? I know it's easier to say because it's a bumper sticker, but then it doesn't quite help, because then it leads us to believe that Black women and Latino women and other women are receiving 81 cents on the dollar for every dollar made by a white male.
Well, Mr. Chair, that's exactly why we consistently disaggregate these numbers, because the differences are vast among women, and it's one of the principles of the ways in which we conduct our research, is to think about disaggregation to understand different experiences that different groups of women are having.
And I agree that women, no matter which group, whether African American or Latino, they're not making what they should make. So I get the point there, but I just want the data to really reflect what the others are making, because then that really captures what is going on. Senator Nelson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I agree with you on the importance of the data, because when we look at this, it's quite alarming. But I've been around data enough to know there's a few questions behind the data that you need to know, and you address some of those, Mr. Chair. But my question is this. I understand that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the data might be a bit skewed for women who chose to stay home. For example, I chose to stay home for 10 years. I had that opportunity. I was glad to be able to do that while we were raising our 3 young boys. I know not every woman has that opportunity or chooses to. But the point is, if that's, so the question, the really nitty-gritty question here is, what's the data that came up with this number of 81 cents for every dollar when comparing women's wages to men's wages? I think that's really important, and there's probably a lot of data behind this very important number, which makes a lot of us see red. We get very concerned about this, but I think it's important to make sure that we know how this data is derived. And so, Dr. Ewig, if you could kind of give us a brief synopsis of how this number was derived. Thank you, Mr.
Dr.
Chair.
Ewig.
Mr. Chair, Senator, we use the American Community Survey. We use a 5-year sample. The reason we use 5 years rather than a single year is that we can have greater confidence in these smaller categories, especially, for example, Native American, which is a very small percentage of our state population. So 5 years allows us to get a better read on what that group, so it's more individuals in that sample on what is being measured. These are for full-time, year-round workers. And so to answer, it doesn't answer your question about experience, but part of what we also see is women oftentimes not working full-time because of care responsibilities. Part-time workers are not included in this number. If we did, we would see much greater disparities, because you would not be measuring the same amount of hours per se compared across categories. So this is all full-time, year-round workers. I will get a little later into the presentation into the causes behind this gender wage gap, and experience is part of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll hold the rest of my comments till we get to that part of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Ewig, if you'll continue, that'd be great. Thank you so much for
Sure.
allowing us to ask some questions. Dr. Ewig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to put this a little bit into perspective. So when you think about a Latina woman who's earning 57 cents while a white male is earning $1, that's about 40% less. And if you think about when that, say it's a Latina mom and she's going to the store, does she get a 40% off coupon for buying her bread? No. Does she get 40% off her rent? No, we all live in the same economy. So this makes big differences in terms of how much bread this woman can bring home, for whether or not she can afford a household or needs to live with other family members in an extended family situation. It matters as to whether or not she can buy a birthday present for that child that year. And she's probably not investing in post-secondary educational opportunities, right, at that 40% cut rate in terms of wages. I think the most disturbing aspect that I find about this 81 cents for every dollar is that we produce this report every 2 years, and in between, my center produces another report called Who Earns that looks just at this wage gap, and the number hasn't changed, or barely has changed. So if we look at 2014, that number was 79 cents on the dollar. So that's not, 2 cents is not a big change over a decade in time. So this wage gap is not budging, and we see similar disparities across groups over time. And it adds up. If you look at our top line data point on this slide, over a lifetime, women lose over $483,000 due to that wage gap. And there I'm talking about all women combined, right? And if we were to disaggregate again and think about Black women or Latina women or Indigenous women, we're looking at about $1 million over their lifetime. We often talk about the wealth gap in this state and across the country, which is wealth being the sum of all of an individual's assets minus their debts. And we know that Minnesota has the third largest racial wealth gap in the country. We don't talk so much about the gender wealth gap, and I don't have a figure for you for Minnesota specifically, but in the United States, in terms of wealth, women overall have 55 cents on those assets, those wealth assets, compared to men having $1. Okay, so there's a gender wealth gap, and that intersects with race, right? And that's where we see this 480,000 or that million over a lifetime, because this gender wage gap is one of the drivers behind the wealth gap. It's not the only one. Inheritance, for example, is a big piece. Housing, owning a house is a big piece of that wealth gap. But income is a big piece. And so you can think about, with this $480,000, what could, say, that same Latina woman, in her case it would be more closer to $1 million. What could she do with an extra $1 million over her lifetime? Of course, she's not going to have it all at once, but she may be able to buy a car that can help her drop her kids off at childcare and then get to work much more easily. It may mean that she can put down a down payment on a starter home. It may mean she can send her child to some kind of post-secondary school option. And those are things that then invest into the next generation. And that's really what wealth is meant to do, and that we hope does, is that investing in the future of future generations. Our research in other parts of the report that you have in your hands also shows that single mothers, especially Black, Latina, and Native American moms, are much less likely to own their homes in the state of Minnesota. Okay, now I'm going to come to the different factors that lead to this wage gap. One is experience. So taking time out of the workforce is an important piece. Counts for, some studies show about 14% of that gap has to do with, and this goes a bit back to Ms. Brower's presentation, if you are younger or if you have less experience in the workforce, which can be because you're younger, or it could be because you took time off. That can mean you're losing time in terms of, when you take time off, of gaining wages over time. About 14% is what we think. Discrimination is the next largest piece, at about 38% of that wage gap can be explained by paying people less than what they are worth and that what others may be making, okay? Half of this, however, is due to occupational segregation, and Ms. Brower's presentation got into that to some degree when she showed you some of that industry data. So here I've got a couple other points on this slide. One is that women make up 56% of Minnesota's minimum wage workers. We were talking about good jobs and bad jobs previously as well. Well, women take up most of those minimum wage jobs across the state. If you represent Greater Minnesota, they make up 58% of the Minnesota minimum wage jobs in your area if you're outside of the metro. In addition, women make up the majority of lower paid service jobs. And in fact, we see women of color concentrated in those jobs at about 29% for Latina, Black, and Indigenous women. And those are areas where we tend to have worse benefits than in other areas of the economy. All of that is part of occupational segregation, where we have some jobs that are paid better, some jobs that are paid less, and it just so happens that those jobs that are paid better happen to be male-dominated, and those that are paid worse are female-dominated. This next slide kind of puts into a slide form some of the data that Ms. Brower was giving to you. At the top of the slide of this graph, kind of the clustering at the top, we have an average wage of about $24 an hour for male-dominated occupations. And at the base of this graphic, you have about $20 an hour for female-dominated occupations. Construction and extraction, the question about mining earlier, that's still at about 3% women, okay, and the rest are men. Whereas at the bottom of the slide, healthcare support, we're looking at 83% women in healthcare support, with really important differences in wages. And this is not about skill, and this is not about education. This is about gender in combination, oftentimes with race. Let me give you another example of a specific occupation. In Minnesota, childcare providers are a 94% female workforce, and most of them have some college education, and they earn on average $14 an hour. We pay janitors in Minnesota $16 an hour. 61% of our janitors are men, and most do not have a college education, right? So the skill level is actually lower, but we pay more. And so it seems to boil down to gender differences. The message that I get from that is that the gender wage disparity means we don't value work that is work predominantly carried out by women, even when greater education and skill are required.
Dr. Ewing?
Yes.
We'd like to go to Senator Durham. I think he has a question.
Just a quick
in the
question
area.
on this slide.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. So is it my understanding then that these jobs fall into that a pay scale of $20 an hour to $24 an hour on average?
So those,
Dr. Ewing?
sorry, Mr. Chair, Senator, that is an average of the lower bars on this versus the upper bars. So when I said childcare worker, for example, at 14, it's falling lower, but it gives you a sense in those categories. We would have to look at the specific occupation to know the exact wage.
Senator Durham?
So there's no correlation with the $24 an hour on the top right of this chart?
There is, but
versus
it.
the 20?
Sorry.
We'll let him finish his question, and then I'll recognize you, Dr.
My
Ewing.
apologies.
Is it okay? Senator Durham, did you finish your question?
Well, yeah, it just surprising that we have those dollar per hour on there, and there's some professions in here that I know make more money than $20 an hour. So I think it's a little misleading the way it's drafted, and I'd just like an explanation on it. Thank you.
Dr. Ewing?
Mr. Chair, Senator, it is to give a sense of the clustering of those jobs at the base of that chart, the average, if we were to average the variety of different occupations that are within that. But you are absolutely correct that there's quite a bit of variation within that.
Any other
Mr.
questions
Mr.
before
Chair.
Dr. Ewing goes forward?
Oh, Mr.
Senator
Chair.
Nelson?
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I need a new pen. This light is already not working. So we'll be getting a new pen for our next committee, but seriously.
I'm glad it's not working, Dr. Nelson.
But
Senator Nelson.
Seriously, though, I do have a very serious question before we leave this. So, no, I'm teasing.
Okay.
Just need the light. So, no, my serious question is, so I want to go back to these numbers because I think this is a very serious issue. And I think it's important that we understand the data correctly. And we don't want to give a quarter to, misunderstanding the data. So this is really critical for me. So I want to understand, as we're looking at this, women make 81 cents for every dollar that a white man earns. Okay, that's an alarming data point. But I want to understand it because what would that be? Kind of do this data math for me if you can, or maybe you need to get back to me on it. I'm not sure what all the inner workings are. But if 14% of that is made up by experience and 50% of that differential is made up by occupational segregation, you see, depending on what the issue is, the solutions are very different as far as what's causing the problem. So is it significant to say then that the differential accounting for the experience difference and the occupational segregation would be 56% of the 81 cents? or how do you adjust this? I'd really like to see this number adjusted to the actual difference between the straight-up pay for doing the same job for the same amount of time. And the best I can tell from the information you've given me is 14% would be experience-related and 50% would be occupational segregation. So what would the number be? Instead of 81 cents, what would it be if you were to eliminate the variances based upon experience and occupational segregation? You might not have that at the top of your head, but that's a number that I'd like to be able to get, if you can handle that.
Dr. Ewing?
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Senator, so that would eliminate about 60% of that gap between 81 cents and $1. Again, where I'm referring to that those aspects that go into this wage gap is based on national studies that have tried to disaggregate what are the causes of the wage gap. And so those particular numbers are not my research, but drawing on others' research of the 1451. And then for discrimination, 38%.
Senator Nelson, before we let Dr. Ewing go forward, and so we can finish up this portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chair.
Nelson.
So just doing some basic math, it looks like it'd be about 51 cents, which I think is still terrible, but I want to make sure I understand what that is as far as the wage differential minus the experience and the occupation segregation. So if you feel comfortable getting that number to us, I would very much like to look at that and know what that is. And then also, it would be good to see how that wage gap data has been collected. We know it's from the ACS survey every 5 years, but it's what numbers, go into making that, and how are they, what's the math behind it? That's would be good to see. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Excuse me. Dr. Ewing, are you ready to go forward? And I'm certain that you can get her that information at a later time. Is that okay?
I can answer quickly,
Oh,
Mr.
yeah.
Chair.
If you can answer it, that'd be great.
So, I think, Senator, I think what you're asking is, if we were to eliminate the experience and the occupational segregation gap, what would we be left with?
Correct.
So we would be around 93 cents to the white male dollar if you eliminated that. I could, with a calculator instead of in my head, maybe come to something a little different, but that's about taking off that 60% of that 20 cents, if I'm right. In terms of the American Community Survey, it is an annual survey of individuals in Minnesota. There is some weighting that the Census Bureau does. It's carried out by the Census Bureau in order to have sufficient numbers of different populations in the state to have an accurate number. But again, we use that 5-year run of the data so that smaller groups are well represented in what otherwise we might see the data make some changes simply based upon survey year to year rather than consistent trends.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, if you'd allow me one
Senator
short
Nelson.
question.
Yes.
Perhaps for our research, I would think we already have laws on the books that prohibit discrimination based upon gender or anything else, really. We should have those laws on the book already, specifically regarding pay. And so you might not have this information at the top of your head, but I'd like to get a review of current laws not allowing any type of discrimination, pay discrimination. We would expect, equal pay, equal work. So I'm just curious at some point if we could get that from our committee.
So Senator Nelson, I see you looking my way, and I'm looking the way at council, and I'm certain that we will show you any human rights issues around there can't be discrimination based on gender. And so that's what I believe that you're getting to with there being this huge disparities. That also leads me into a discussion that I know that there's been a big push around the ERA and whether something should be done with that in order to make sure that women are, that it's in our Constitution that women are paid equal to men. But I'm certain that's not where you wanted me to go. But Senator Nelson.
No, that's what I want to know. I want to know the current laws and see where the holes are. Thank you.
Sounds good. Dr. Ewig, anything else?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I know this committee is quite interested in science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM areas. If we look a little bit closer at that, in this year's report, we decided to break down women's participation in STEM into two general categories. One, your more traditional narrow category of looking at life and physical sciences, engineering, math, technology, and then expanding it to include health. We just had a big presentation on health just before me. And it's a huge area of our state's economy. It's also a place where we find many more women working, and it's science-based. We have some really different numbers if we look at these two different kinds of STEM. Under the narrow definition, women are a minority. They're 26%. Women in the narrow STEM workforce compared to 74% men. But if we add health, that changes. We see 51% in the STEM plus health category compared to 49% men because of the domination of women in some categories of health, like nursing, for example. So this slide shows you how different groups of women, again, broken down by race and ethnicity, and how they participate either in that narrow version of STEM alone or STEM with including health occupations. I think one take-home message here is that most women are underrepresented in that narrow version of STEM, but even some are underrepresented in health occupations. And there's a wide range, as you all know, within health in terms of wages and skill that are involved. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about leadership. So we have those three main drivers of that wage gap experience that we've been talking about. Occupational segregation, I just spent quite a bit of time on, but there's also discrimination, which we've just had mentioned. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish occupational segregation from discrimination. Oftentimes women try to enter male-dominated fields and they find the climate is not one that makes them want to stay, and then they leave and exit into other kinds of occupations. Other times we have that apples-to-apples comparison where you might have a woman and a man with the same years of experience, the same level of education, working the same job, and one is being paid more than the other, and it happens to be the man. And that we can boil down oftentimes to discrimination. Other times it's discrimination in terms of advancement, in terms of leadership, that glass ceiling, whether women, whatever their race or ethnicity may be, white, black, indigenous, Latina, Asian, whether they're able to move up in their workplace. We know that only 9 of the 10 top 78 publicly held companies in Minnesota are led by women. We also even know in the nonprofit sector where the workforce is dominated by women, in leadership it's only 37% that are nonprofit leaders. That deficit in leadership isn't just about career opportunity. It's not just about wages. It does add up to wages. It's also about what women bring to corporations, to nonprofits, to the public sector. Women bring different experiences, different life experiences that are brought to the job that then point to different kinds of solutions oftentimes. There's actually very good research on legislators, both at the state level and at the national level, showing that women hold different priorities when they come to advancing legislation, often advancing more that focuses on families or on health, often stemming from their experience being in charge of those kinds of issue areas in their home life. And I would be remiss to not talk about childcare to this committee. That goes back to that experience piece. Sometimes women decide it is just not worth it to enter the workforce because the cost of childcare will outpace the cost of their wages. That was my case when I was beginning as a professor. The federal guidelines recommend that families only spend 7% of their income on childcare, and 94% of Minnesota families are unable to meet that mark. If you take a look at this slide, the horizontal lines are the percent of median income for that particular race or ethnic group that is being spent by single mother-headed families or married families on childcare. And we can see that even white families, white married couple families, are spending 17% of their income on childcare. That's still a far cry from that 7%. But indigenous moms, indigenous single moms, it is out of the question, because center-based quality childcare would cost more than their income that they're bringing in altogether. Minnesota ranks 10th highest in the nation in terms of cost of quality center-based infant childcare. For cost of quality center-based childcare, and infant childcare is about $17,500 a year. That's more than tuition and fees at the University of Minnesota at $16,500 a year. But we know that college students can get a part-time job, they can get financial aid, they can get loans, but babies can't do that. This is a whole different kind of expense that families are shouldering. So, and there's often not enough childcare. We know that across the state there's one childcare space for every 2 children. It's especially a problem in central Minnesota, where we've seen many family-based childcare providers close their doors in recent years. So if we want women and all the talents and experience that they can bring in the workforce, if we want them to contribute to that lack of labor that Ms. Brower was speaking to before, even though we already have high rates of participation, it could be perhaps at more hours per week, and taking some of filling some of those jobs that are needed by businesses. But that means we're going to have to deal with the discrimination, the occupational segregation, and deal with the care challenges, providing childcare, elder care, care for individuals with disabilities, that provide the infrastructure to get families to the workplace. I'd like to move to close with some solutions. So we've talked about different drivers of the wage gap, one being discrimination. I know that there's a legislative proposal under development now about pay transparency. That's one approach. It's something that a couple of other states are now just beginning to implement. Some other countries have had success with pay transparency. It's harder for employers to discriminate if they know that the wage disparities that they have on their payrolls will be public. A little bit of self-policing can go on when there is that transparency. It also helps workers to know that the disparities exist, so that they can do a better job of advocating for themselves in the workplace and their wages. And returning to those existing anti-discrimination laws that Senator Nelson mentioned with pay transparency, it's easier to use those tools that are already at our disposal to enforce laws against discrimination. When it comes to occupational segregation, one approach that's fairly simple is to raise the minimum wage, because, as I showed, we have a majority of women in minimum wage jobs, especially in Greater Minnesota, and you have concentrations in the low-wage sector. You can easily, in a very simple way, begin to narrow that gap with a higher minimum wage. I know this committee has oversight over programs that have to do with encouraging women to enter the trades, those high-paid trades that were at the top of my occupational segregation graph earlier. It would be interesting to know, I don't know this, it would be interesting to know from those offices that run those programs, to what degree of success they have had in training women and women staying in those jobs over the long term, and what the wages look like.
Dr. Ewig, we have gone over here, but we wanted to give you a chance to quickly get to your conclusion. But before that, I'm going to let Senator Draheim ask a question.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. You know, I know we're going off of old data here, going back 2 years, but I really have not seen a job being posted for minimum wage in 2 years. I'm just to be frank, and I'm in and out of businesses all the time, and I pay attention to job postings, and I have a real interest in seeing people succeed and try to help people find a job and line up people. But, you know, minimum wage is what, $10.85, I think, in Minnesota now? And most job postings I see is a minimum of, you know, $15 to $20 an hour throughout probably the lower pay scale portion of the state, or one of the lower portions of the state. So I do have concern with raising minimum wage when the pay scale is literally almost double what minimum wage is. I'm glad to see wages have increased. And I think we all agree that there are disparities that are getting better, but not getting better fast enough for most of us. But I don't think raising the minimum wage would really affect the numbers here, since most people make way above minimum wage.
Dr. Ewick, briefly, and I see you have your key factors that drives the wealth gap, and if you could briefly react to Senator Draheim's question, and then if we could quickly get to your last slide.
Okay. Mr. Chair, Senator, the data on the minimum wage is more recent. It's taken from DEED. We asked them to make the calculation for us. It's not taken from survey data. I'd have to look back at my footnote in the status report as to whether that goes through December of 22 or whether it goes through mid-23, which is when we were preparing this report. So it's still a significant amount in minimum wage jobs. As we know, there's variation from metro to rural and greater Minnesota based upon minimum wage laws. You're absolutely correct that wages have been increasing recently, which is a good thing for workers to be able to afford. Mr. Chair, to close, the wealth gap was actually a slide among our extra slides, but it is a good way to wrap up. I've been talking about the income as one of the major factors leading to the wealth gap that we see in the state. Inheritance is another piece, and home ownership is another, but they're all combined. Right? To have stable housing is often what can lead you to have a stable job, which then can allow you to purchase a house long-term and to have wealth long-term, all of which adds up to stronger future generations. And that's really what we want to have our eyes on, not just economic stability today, but prosperity in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Because I think we asked the questions that we were going to ask. We only have roughly 16 more minutes before committee's over. I want to give ample time to Ms. Barley. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is the VP of Strategic Initiatives. If you could come up, that would be great.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, it's nice to see so many of you again. I think there was some confusion. I am here with the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, so I don't need any additional time, but thank you.
Well, that's wonderful. Let me just say, but thank you for being here. I'm looking at my notes and see that we had all three of you listed as testifiers, but we are certainly excited and happy that you're here. Thank you to the testifiers for the information that has been presented. I think that connects very nicely as it pertains to information, as when Dr. Bauer was up talking about this, who is the state demographer, just talking about women and some of the things that are going there, and this connects for us to get a clearer picture of the work that needs to be done in this area. Any other questions from the committee? Senator Herr.
Mr. Chair, appreciate the time and the presentation as well. earlier, you know, I felt this little guilt that I was not complete when I was referenced to the Asian American community, being that seems like I'm pick and choose, but I just want folks to know, members to know, and Senator Champion knows, so sometimes I cut short just because of that. But the majority of Asian American in our state are Southeast Asian. That's why it's important. That's why I bring it up. You know, otherwise, you know, it's maybe less significant. But I just want to point it out. I see Mr. Frost down there still here, so that's why, again, to work in the Asian community in Minnesota, do put the thoughts and intellect into the Southeast Asian population, which face disparity greatly, just like Mexicans, American, Blacks, and East African. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I think that's important. And I did see this slide on home ownership because I was just speaking to a group earlier today about home ownership and the importance of it because it is a part of generating wealth. There's been a lot of discussion about multi units, you know, whether they're duplexes or others, that sometimes gets a little lost because people see the need for affordable housing and more housing, but I think they miss the whole idea that if you're looking at a duplex and someone has very limited income and the vast majority of heads of households in communities of color are women and their wages are already low, this argument that it's okay because they're going to generate wealth by having a duplex as opposed to a single family home just gets lost because it costs more money in order to have a duplex than it does a starter home, and especially when the incomes are low. So with that being said, if nothing else, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.